They called her the Barren Lady, a whisper that followed her through the cold stone halls of her father's castle like a persistent, chilling draught. Lady Ilara had once been the pride of Duke Theron's house, a bride traded for a decade of peace with a neighboring rival. But the peace had held, her husband had died of a fever, and she had returned home with nothing to show for her union but a title of widowhood and an empty womb. Her worth, once measured in alliances and potential heirs, had evaporated. Now, she was simply a flaw in the ducal tapestry, a thread he wished to snip away. Her beauty, once praised in song, had become a cruel irony, a lovely but empty vessel. She moved through her days in a shroud of silent humiliation, her value stripped away layer by layer until all that remained was the hollow echo of what she was supposed to be. The end came on a cold, grey morning in the great hall. The Duke, her father, sat upon his carved oak throne, his face a mask of bored indifference. He had summoned the blacksmith from the Whisperwood, a man the court sneeringly called a barbarian, a hulking commoner who lived beyond the civilized pale of the city walls. This man, Calen, was a master of his craft, the only smith capable of forging the quantity and quality of steel the Duke required for his expanding army. Calen stood before the throne, immense and silent, his leather apron stained with the soot of his forge. He did not bow deeply like the courtiers, but gave a short, respectful nod, his gaze direct and unflinching. He was a mountain of a man, his presence raw and elemental in the perfumed air of the court. "The price for 300 blades and hauberks is steep, Smith," Duke Theron began, his voice dripping with condescension. "Gold does not grow on trees, even in your wild forest." Calen's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, waiting. He had named his price, a fair one for the labor and the rare mountain ore he used. The Duke smiled, a predator's gleam in his eyes. He gestured, and 2 guards brought Ilara forward. She stumbled slightly, her fine silk dress a mockery against the starkness of the moment. "I have a different currency in mind," the Duke declared, his voice ringing with theatrical cruelty. "I will give you my daughter. She is of noble blood, gently bred. But she has proven fallow. Useless to a man of standing. Perhaps a rustic like you can find a purpose for her. A servant. A bed warmer. It is of no consequence to me. You will have your payment in blood, not coin." "My blood." A collective gasp, sharp and horrified, was stolen by the hall's high rafters. Ilara felt the world tilt, the faces of the court blurring into a gallery of morbid curiosity and pity. This was a degradation beyond imagining. She was not even being sold, she was being bartered, like livestock, her entire existence reduced to the value of sharpened steel. She stared at the floor, the polished marble reflecting a distorted, broken version of herself. She waited for the barbarian's coarse laughter, for his greedy acceptance. But there was only a profound silence. She dared to lift her eyes and saw him looking not at her father, but at her. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, held no mockery, no lust. They held something else. An unreadable stillness, a flicker of what might have been recognition of a shared pain. "I accept the terms," Calen said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to shake the very stones beneath her feet. With that simple sentence, Ilara's life in the world of men was over. She had been given to a barbarian, a final, public casting out. The journey from the castle was a blur of shame. She was not bound, but she felt a captive's chains on her spirit. Calen led a sturdy packhorse and walked beside her, his silence an unnerving weight between them. He did not touch her, did not speak to her. They left the towering city walls behind, plunging into the deep, ancient woods that swallowed the road. The air changed, losing the scent of coal smoke and refuse, and taking on the clean, damp smell of earth, pine, and decaying leaves. The world of cold grandeur, of marble and silk, was replaced by the rustling, living chaos of the forest. When they finally arrived at his home, it was not the crude hut she had imagined, but a solid, well-kept cottage of fieldstone and dark timber, nestled beside a roaring forge whose chimney breathed a steady plume of grey smoke into the twilight. He led her inside. The cottage consisted of one large room, dominated by a great stone hearth where a fire crackled warmly. It was simple, rustic, yet impeccably clean. The air smelled of wood smoke, baking bread, and the faint, metallic tang of iron. There was a small table, 2 chairs, and a curtained-off alcove. Kaelan gestured towards it. "That will be your space," he said, his first words to her since the great hall. "No one will disturb you there." He then moved to the hearth, ladling stew from a black iron pot into a wooden bowl. He placed it on the table with a piece of dark bread. He did not command her to eat, he simply provided, then turned away to tend the fire, giving her space, giving her a dignity she had not been shown by her own kin. She ate, the simple, hearty food a balm to her gnawed-out insides. She expected cruelty, a master's rough hand. She found only a quiet, solemn respect that confused her more than any brutality could have. That night, tucked into a surprisingly soft straw mattress behind the curtain, she heard him speaking in a low, gentle murmur. Peeking through a small gap, she saw him kneeling by a small cot in the corner, a cot she hadn't noticed before. In it lay a small boy of about 5 or 6, with a shock of dark hair and wide, frightened eyes that were fixed on Kaelan's face. The boy was silent, utterly still. Kaelan smoothed the hair from the child's brow, his large, calloused hands moving with an impossible tenderness. He was showing the boy a small wooden bird he had carved, turning it over and over, whispering about its wings, its beak, but the boy made no sound, no reaction at all, save for the faint tremor in his small frame. Elara watched, her heart clenching with a strange, unfamiliar ache. This was not the home of a brute. It was the home of a grieving father and a wounded child. The next day, the true nature of her father's bargain was revealed, and it was not what Kaelan had accepted. After a long morning of silence, where he worked at his forge and she stayed inside, clutching the tatters of her pride, he finally came to her. He did not loom over her, but knelt so their eyes were level. Beside him, holding his hand in a desperate grip, was the small boy, Liam. "My Lord Duke offered you as a wife," Kaelan said, his voice low and steady. "I did not accept that offer. I cannot. My wife, Elspeth, died a year past. Since that day, my son has not spoken a word." He looked from Elara's face to his son's, a deep-seated pain etched around his eyes. "I saw you in that hall. I saw the books you carried in your youth. I know you are learned. The Duke saw a barren woman. I saw a teacher. I did not trade my steel for a servant, Lady Elara. I traded it for a chance to hear my son's voice again. That is all I ask of you. Teach him. Speak to him. The rest of the house, your comfort, it is yours, freely given." The revelation struck her with the force of a physical blow. Her worth had not been measured by her body, but by her mind. The one part of her that her father had always dismissed as a frivolous indulgence for a woman was the very thing this barbarian had sought. She looked at the boy, Liam, who stared at the floor, his small shoulders hunched. In his silent, cavernous grief, she saw a reflection of her own. She, who had been defined by her failure to give life, was now being asked to bring a life back from the brink of silence. For the first time in a year, a purpose, fragile and terrifying, began to bloom in the barren wasteland of her heart. She gave a slow, hesitant nod. "I will try," she whispered, the words feeling foreign and momentous on her tongue. So began the slow, quiet rhythm of their new life. Elara found a small slate and chalk and began to draw letters for Liam. She read to him from the one book she'd been allowed to bring, a collection of old fables. At first, he would not look at her, flinching if she came too close. But she was patient. She would sit by the fire, her voice a soft, steady murmur, telling stories of clever foxes and brave knights, filling the cottage silence not with demands, but with gentle invitations. Kaelan never interfered. He would work at his forge from dawn until dusk, the rhythmic clang of his hammer a constant, reassuring heartbeat for their strange little household. In the evenings, he would mend tools or carve his small wooden animals, his large presence a solid wall of protection around them. One afternoon, as she was reading a story about a ship on a stormy sea, Liam, for the first time, crept closer. He sat on the floor beside her stool, his eyes on the book. He did not speak, but he pointed a small, hesitant finger at the drawing of a whale. Elara's heart seized. "Yes," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "That is a great whale. It sings in the deep ocean." He looked up at her, and for a fleeting second, his eyes lost their haunted look and filled with a child's simple wonder. It was a victory smaller than a whisper, yet it felt more triumphant than any courtly praise she had ever received. When Kaelin came in for his supper, she told him what had happened. He looked over at his son, who was now tracing the letter on the slate, and a look of profound, heart-wrenching gratitude passed over his face. He simply nodded at Elara, but in that nod, she felt more seen and valued than she had in her entire life. Days bled into weeks. The autumn deepened, painting the whisperwood in hues of gold and crimson. Elara learned the cadence of the forge, the smell of hot iron, the hiss of steam as Kaelin quenched his blades. She learned to bake bread in the hearth oven, her hands, once soft and useless, growing capable. Kaelin, in turn, learned the quiet power of her presence. He saw the way Liam's shoulders were slowly hunching, the way the boy would now sit at the table with them for meals instead of hiding in his cot. He found himself watching her, the firelight catching the gold in her hair as she read, her noble profile softened by the humble setting. He was a man walled up by grief, but he felt the first few stones beginning to loosen. They began to talk in the evenings, their conversations hesitant at first, then flowing like a slow-moving river. She spoke of her gilded cage, of the cold loneliness of a political marriage and the public shame of her body's betrayal. He spoke of Elspeth, of her laughter and her love for the forest, of the swift, cruel fever that had stolen her away, leaving a silence that had swallowed their son. They did not try to mend each other's sorrow, they simply sat with it together, two solitary souls finding a strange comfort in the geography of their shared wounds. They were building a bridge across the chasm of their pasts, plank by quiet plank, with shared stories and sympathetic glances. The first snows of winter brought with them a fierce, howling storm that raged for 2 days, trapping them inside the cottage. The wind shrieked like a banshee, and the world outside was a swirling vortex of white. On the second night, a sound like a giant's fist cracking the sky was followed by a tremendous crash. The entire cottage shuddered. Liam screamed, a raw, terrified sound, the first noise he had made in over a year. Before Elara could react, Kaelin moved with impossible speed, crossing the room and throwing his body over her and Liam, shielding them as the wall near the hearth groaned and splintered. A massive pine branch had torn through the roof, stopping just short of their fireplace. The immediate danger passed, leaving a gaping hole to the screaming wind. Cold and snow poured in. Kaelin, his face grim, worked to block the hole with heavy timbers and oilcloths while Elara tried to soothe the trembling, sobbing Liam. The fire was their only source of heat and light against the ferocious cold. When the worst of the breach was sealed, they huddled together on the hearthstones, wrapped in every blanket Kaelin owned. Liam, exhausted from his terror and his scream, had finally fallen into a fitful sleep between them. The wind still howled, but inside their little circle of warmth, there was a profound quiet. Elara was shivering, less from cold and more from shock. Kaelin, seeing this, shifted closer and draped a heavy fur pelt around her shoulders, his arm lingering there for a moment. His touch was not possessive, but protective, a solid anchor in the storm. It sent a jolt of warmth through her that had nothing to do with the fire. In that moment, stripped of rank and title, of past and future, they were just a man and a woman, sheltering a child against the darkness. She leaned her head back against the solid wall of his chest, and he did not pull away. The barrier between them, the unspoken divide of noble and commoner, shattered into 1,000 pieces, swept away by the storm. They didn't speak of it, but in the silent language of touch and proximity, a new truth was forged. As winter thawed, so did the world's animosity begin to seep into their fragile peace. Rumors from the city, carried by traveling merchants, became a poison. The tale of the Barren noblewoman and the Barbarian was a source of cruel amusement in the taverns. Duke Theron, hearing that his discarded daughter had not withered in misery but had instead found a strange sort of contentment, was incensed. It was a defiance he could not tolerate. He began to apply pressure. Merchants who dealt with Kaelin found their goods heavily taxed at the city gates. The captain of the Duke's guard made it known that any who traded with the Whisperwood blacksmith would lose the Duke's favor. Kaelin's contracts dried up, one by one. The flow of coin that fed them trickled to a stop. The community of woodsmen and farmers, fearful of the Duke's wrath, began to shun them. Their isolation was no longer a choice, it was a siege. The summons came on a brisk spring morning, delivered by 2 of the Duke's guards. He demanded their presence at court. The walk to the castle was a grim reversal of Ilara's first journey. This time, she walked not in shame, but with a cold, simmering anger. Cailan walked beside her, his face a stony mask, but she could feel the tension coiled in his powerful frame. In the great hall, her father sat on his throne, his expression one of smug triumph. He did not even deign to address Cailan, his eyes fixed on Ilara. "I hear you have taken well to your new station," he sneered. "Playing mother to a mute brat in a hovel. Have you forgotten who you are?" The Ilara of a year ago would have crumbled. But this Ilara, forged in the quiet dignity of the cottage and tempered by a love she was only just beginning to understand, stood tall. "No, father," she said, her voice clear and steady, ringing through the suddenly silent hall. "For the first time, I am learning precisely who I am. I am more than a name and a title. And this man," she turned to Cailan, her gaze unwavering, "has more nobility in his little finger than you possess in your entire duchy. His name is Cailan, and he is the most honorable man I have ever known." The Duke's face contorted in a mask of pure fury at her defiance. He dismissed them with a wave, but his threat hung in the air. "You have made your choice. Now you will live with it. Or rather, you will starve with it." They returned to the cottage under a cloud of despair. The Duke's threat was real. With no income, they could not survive. The last of their flour was gone, the last of their salted meat. Ruin was no longer a distant threat, it was a guest at their table. That evening, as the last light faded, they stood by the cold forge, the silence heavy with all that was unsaid. "He will not stop until we are broken," Cailan said, his voice rough with defeat. "I have brought this upon you." Ilara turned to him, her heart aching at the pain in his eyes. "No," she said, stepping closer, placing her hand on his arm. "You gave me a life when I had none. You gave me a purpose." She looked at the man who had seen worth in her when all others saw waste. "He cannot break us." Cailan looked down at her, his stormy eyes searching her face. The space between them crackled with a year of unspoken emotion. "Ilara," he breathed her name, a prayer, and a confession all in one. He cupped her face in his hands, his touch infinitely gentle. "I cannot lose you." In that moment of shared desperation, with the world arrayed against them, the truth spilled forth. "And you," she whispered. "I love you, Cailan, and I love you," he answered, his voice thick with emotion. He lowered his head and kissed her, a kiss not of passion, but of profound, desperate belonging. It was their ultimate act of rebellion, a declaration of love in the face of tyranny, their only shield against the coming darkness. Their love, confessed in the shadow of ruin, became their strength. The next morning, it was Ilara who woke with a fire in her eyes. Despair had given way to defiance. She was her father's daughter in one respect, she understood power, and she understood the laws that governed it. "My great-grandfather," she began, pacing the small cottage, signed a charter with the first free guilds that settled outside the city walls. He did it to encourage trade. It granted them certain protections, certain autonomies, to keep them from being beholden to the whims of any single lord. Cailan watched her, a spark of hope igniting in his chest. "I remember studying it with my tutor. My father has forgotten it. Or, more likely, he believes everyone else has." She stopped, her eyes shining with fierce intelligence. "He cannot legally interfere with the trade of a chartered guildsman. It is his own ancestors' law." Their first task was to find the charter. Their second was to find allies. They went to Father Michael, the old priest in the forest chapel, a man whose bell Cailan had forged for the price of a few chickens when the parish was poor. The priest was a kind man who had seen the change in the silent Liam, had seen the quiet decency of the life Cailan and Ilara had built. He listened to their story, his brow furrowed with concern. When Ilara spoke of the charter, his eyes lit with recognition. He led them to an old, dust-covered chest in the chapel's vestry. And there it was, a roll of heavy parchment, sealed with the ducal crest of a bygone era. Their hope now had a foundation of ink and law. with the priest's blessing and the charter in hand, they began to speak to the other craftsmen and farmers, people who had also suffered under the duke's heavy-handed taxes and capricious whims. Seeing the charter, and seeing the courage of the man and woman who dared to stand against the duke, their fear began to turn to anger, and then to resolve. The final confrontation was not on a battlefield, but in the town square, at a meeting of the guilds. Duke Theron was there, expecting to preside over the formal stripping of Caelan's trade rights. He sat, smug and imperious, as Caelan and Ilara were called forward. But instead of begging for mercy, Ilara unrolled the ancient charter. Her voice, clear and strong, resonated across the silent square as she read the words of her own ancestor, words that guaranteed the rights of the very people her father sought to crush. She presented evidence, testimonials from other merchants of the Duke's illegal interference, his personal vendetta masquerading as state policy. She did not raise her voice, she used logic, law, and truth as her weapons. The Duke's face went from smug, to confused, to pale, to purple with rage. He was trapped, not by swords, but by the legacy he so proudly claimed and the laws he had so arrogantly ignored. The guild leaders, bolstered by the charter and the crowd's support, declared Caelan's rights intact and formally condemned the Duke's actions. He was defeated, not by a rival army, but by the intelligence of the daughter he had thrown away and the integrity of the commoner he had despised. In the end, Duke Theron was left diminished, a tyrant exposed. His authority was fractured, his hypocrisy laid bare for all to see. He had become a mirror of Ilara's initial state, shamed, powerless, and isolated by his own actions. For Ilara and Caelan, the victory was quiet but absolute. They were free. They were offered lands, titles, a place of honor within the city. But they refused. Their kingdom was not one of stone walls and political power. It was the small cottage, the roaring forge, and the deep, silent woods. They returned home not to reclaim an old life, but to continue building the new one they had forged together in the fires of adversity. Their humble home, once a symbol of exile, was now their castle, its hearth their throne. One late summer afternoon, as the sun slanted through the trees, Ilara and Caelan were in the small garden they had planted, their hands in the rich earth. Liam was nearby, watching them. He had been growing more confident, his silence less a wall of fear and more a quiet observation. He looked at Ilara, who was laughing as Caelan brushed a smudge of dirt from her nose. A look of concentration crossed the boy's face. He took a breath, and then, a word, clear and perfect, broke the afternoon's peace. Mama Ilara froze, her heart stopping in her chest. She turned slowly to look at him. He was smiling, a true, brilliant smile. He then turned his gaze to Caelan, who was staring in stunned, joyful disbelief. "Papa," Liam said, the second word coming easier than the first. In that moment, the last of the wounds healed. The silence was finally, completely broken. Their family, born of shame and sorrow, was reborn, whole and complete. True nobility, they had discovered, is not a birthright. It is not found in titles, or bloodlines, or castles of cold stone. It is a quality of the spirit, a quiet strength forged in kindness, resilience, and love. True worth is not granted by others, but earned in the crucible of hardship. It is the courage to see value where the world sees none, and the grace to build a kingdom not of power, but of the heart. For in the end, the most beautiful and enduring things are not inherited, but built, hand in hand, against the odds.